Hello friends and welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. My name is Cait and today we are going to talk about my top books of all time. So it must have been over a year ago, I reckon, that I first made my top books video, and I wanted to revisit that video today. See if I still would rate the books that I put in that video as some of my top books, and mention a couple more top books that I have come across since I made that video. So let's take a quick trip down memory lane to see what that video was like. I have the video on my iPad, so let's watch it.
This pile here. Try that again. Hello everyone, my name is Cait. I'm a part-time English literature student at the University
Oh, I
of
seem so
Oxford.
nervous.
The other day, someone asked me what my top books would be that I would recommend, or the best that I've read, and it really got me thinking about my bookshelves and what books that I have read and what I would recommend.
I love that in this video. So we were in our previous house and I just had like these, what probably most people would have considered big bookshelves, but now that I have like all my big bookshelves behind me, it looks so small and petite. It's adorable.
Put this little video together and talk about my top 5 books. The first point to call, I think, is to
Okay, so I basically go through my bookshelves and pick out books. I think that's a good idea, is actually just have a sweep through the bookshelves. Okay, so the first book that I identify in this video is The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And this book really got me thinking when I started reading critically. It got me thinking about reading critically. Now, I still maintain that this book has problematic elements to it. I'm not going to deny that. And I'm not going to say that this book in particular aligns with like my personal values. But I think this book is still a fascinating piece of literature and the writing is really and truly phenomenal. Would I consider The Fountainhead one of my top books? I suppose I'm actually going to distinguish here. I would definitely say The Fountainhead is, and this copy of The Fountainhead that I have is probably one of my most prized possessions in my bookshelf collection. I managed to pick up this copy of The Fountainhead a couple of years ago from my secondhand bookstore for like a really decent price, and I don't think they knew what they had. So I was really thrilled. I was really thrilled with this purchase. Out of all of Rand's work, I would probably say that my favorite piece of her writing is We the Living. And We the Living is a bit more autobiographical. It's not entirely autobiographical. There are some fictional elements to it. But I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was her first published book is We the Living. And for me, that book just holds something a bit more dear to me than The Fountainhead. Maybe because it doesn't touch on as many problematic areas as The Fountainhead does or Atlas Shrugged does. Keep going. And I still have both of my copies of The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, We the Living. I have all of those books on my bookshelf. Giovanni's Room. James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, I would still say, is one of my top reads ever. I absolutely adore James Baldwin as a writer, and I'm trying to work my way through his collection of works, and there's a lot, so I don't think I I don't think I'll get it done anytime soon. But Giovanni's Room is still, I would still maintain, one of my favorite reads of all time. It's so beautiful, it's so profound, and it's such an important piece of literature, especially if you read about Baldwin and his philosophies and his advocacy. This book is so incredible. I just loved it so much, and it would still definitely be one of my top reads. And it's tiny, it's really small. This is just the intro.
Oh, you know what? Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yep, Stoner, I agree. This is one of my favorite books. I am absolutely gutted that I lent this book to someone. I can't remember who I lent this book to, and I have not got a copy with me. But that's fine, because the thing is that I really want to get a beautiful copy of Stoner by John Williams. This book, for me, I've spoken about it on this channel before, and I love this book with all of my heart. So I would absolutely still keep it on the top of my list. Oh, then we get on to Ulysses.
Yeah, I know. I spoke about this book recently as well. Ulysses by James Joyce.
Yes, Ulysses, by far one of my favorite books of all time, still would be one of my favorite books of all time. I would absolutely agree with it, and I've managed to nab myself a beautiful folio edition copy. This isn't a first edition, but it's a folio edition of the first edition of Ulysses that was ever printed. And if you know the backstory about Ulysses, you may not know, but Ulysses was a banned book. It was printed by Shakespeare and Company in Paris, but it was banned in the United States, and for a while it was banned in the UK for being too racy, I suppose, is the way that it would be spoken about. But so it was a banned book, and so there were multiple editions that were created and then released. And this folio edition that I have is from the first edition that was ever published. If I could get myself a first edition of Ulysses, I would probably cry, but I would also be bankrupt because they're about the same price as a house. So that is a far-fetched dream. But yes, I would 100% say Ulysses. Let's keep going. Tomb of Sand. Yes.
Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree. So many words for this book. It's
I love me a thick book, don't I?
That is going on to the pile. Got quite a big pile.
Yes. Tomb of Sand, 120%. For me, this book came down to the fact that I have not to this date read a piece of work that I think has been translated so perfectly. Now, granted, I have not read Tomb of Sand in the original, but the author's note, or the interpreter's note in the back, talks about how she utilizes this concept of the sound of words creating the atmosphere. And I can only imagine how difficult it was for, I think it was Daisy Rookwood who was the translator. I can only imagine how difficult it was for Daisy Rookwood to look at this book and recreate that sense of atmosphere. But when you read this book, you absolutely get that sense of atmosphere coming through it. So for me, that's why I still think this is one of the best translated pieces that I've ever read.
It's really good. Never Let Me Go as well. It's also really good.
Nervous
And
Conditions
Mantel's
was one of my other picks, and Wolf Hall.
You know what? I'm just going to pull them out. They are absolutely exceptional books. And I feel like they need honorable mentions.
All right, let's see what I ended up picking. Nervous Conditions, Wolf Hall, Never Let Me Go, and June. Oh, those are hard. I think I would probably... I still think they're all exceptional books. And I'd be hard-pressed to push them off of my top list. But I do think there are some... Maybe not Wolf Hall. I still think Wolf Hall is like one of my favorite books of all time. And an exceptional piece of historical fiction writing. In my mind, nothing comes close to Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel. But I'm going to take a quick pause. I'm going to do a quick sweep of my bookshelves and see if there are any other books that I want to pull out that for me would be on my top list. I've got a significant number of books to talk about. Let's talk about them. Now, I do just want to preface this by saying that a lot of these books are a lot more contemporary, and I am really focusing on that. But there is also something that I want to mention, is that to say, like, this doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't books out there that I don't love. Obviously, if you gave me any Austen novel, I would love it, and I've read all of her work. I would reread all of that all over again. I think these books are just kind of maybe different books. That the whole point of this video, the whole point of sharing my favorite or my top books, is to maybe identify for you a new book that you would love and that you would read and that you would be like, oh, this is one of my favorite books. Whereas everyone in the world can recommend Austen, and I absolutely would recommend Austen. But these books are maybe slightly different, and I think that's why I want to talk about them. So let's start off with the first one on the pile, which is The Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. This book I read last year. I've recently spoken about it in my 2024 reading wrap-up. I will link that above. It's a fabulous, fabulous book, collection of short stories that are written by Jhumpa Lahiri. She is an incredible, incredible author, and both of the works of hers that I've read, The Interpreter of Maladies and Whereabouts, are probably some of my favorite reads ever. But I think Interpreter of Maladies just hits so much more. It has so much more of an impact. It hits so well. So this is definitely one of the books that I would consider as one of my top books ever. Another book that I read last year, this is Solenoid. And again, I'm not going to speak about this too much. I spoke about it a lot in my previous video, and I also spoke about it a lot when I finished this book, because the emotional impact that this book has for me has been insane. I cannot stop thinking about this book. And after a good amount of time, because it is hefty, it doesn't look like a long read, but it is a really, really long read, and it's really dense, and it's very, very difficult. But after reading it, and after maybe giving it a couple of months, I would love to reread this book now that I know kind of what happens, because the nuances, the particulars of writing, the atmospheric side of this work is phenomenal. And yes, 100%, it's like reading Ulysses, but in a different light, because it's just incredible. I believe it is translated as well. It is. Yeah, I think it's translated from Romanian. I think that I'm not alone in saying that anything that Claire Keegan writes, I will read and I will love. Small Things Like These, however, is just one of the most incredibly beautifully written short books that I have ever read. But I think I will caveat this to say that I have spoken to a number of people who just said they don't get the hype around Keegan. And I think unless you kind of have an understanding of Irish history, particularly for Small Things Like These, but also for Foster, you will struggle to see the beauty in what is unsaid in Keegan's work. And I've spoken about her work a fair bit again in my last video, my 2024 video, because I read Foster and So Late in the Day. But I think what's incredible, as I say, what's incredible about Keegan is her restraint. The way she writes and the restraint that she uses is just something I have never seen in any other book. So I definitely think it's one of the top books. Again, a lot of the books that I've brought here are actually books that I read last year. Sally Rooney's Intermezzo, for me, is like the perfect combination of Ulysses and a Russian literature novel. Like, this book for me is just so brilliant. Its take on grief is really fantastic, but I think what sets this book apart from me is actually the writing and the characterization and the atmosphere that she creates. I'm all about atmosphere when it comes to a book, and this book has it in aces. I just loved this book, and I do think it is my top Rooney. I loved Beautiful World, Where Are You? But I think the writing in Intermezzo is spectacular. Okay, last book that I'll talk about that I read end of last year, this book, Vita Nostra. This is a fantasy take. This is a fantasy novel, first and foremost, but it is a translated fantasy novel, and it is translated from Ukrainian. It's written by two people, by Marina and Sergey Dyachenko. I can't pronounce the name. I'm butchering it, so I'm not going to try. But this book was weird. It was interesting. It was different, and it was like Kafka's take on fantasy, and I just loved this book. I think it would be one of my favorites ever. It will continue to be one of my favorites. But sticking on the fantasy side of it, because I'm not a massive fantasy girl, but I love a really, really good fantasy novel, so I'm very, very particular when it comes to my fantasy reading. I definitely want to recommend this. This is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, written by Susanna Clarke. This book is so good. I'm desperate to reread it and get back into it. I've read it and I finished it, but I'm desperate to reread this book. This book for me is just, it's so clever. It's Dickensian. It's set in Victorian England. Really beautifully done. Clarke did an incredible job of adapting sort of that Victorian literary tradition of writing with detail, but everything in this book is connected, and that's why I say it's like Dickensian. It's just it could have been written by Charles Dickens, this book, but obviously it brings into play some magical elements, and I love the story. I love the writing, and the ending was exceptional. Absolutely exceptional. Anyone who is looking to read a book where you are going to feel completely and utterly comforted by the end of the book, even though this book is a slog, it's like over 1,000 pages, then Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is for you. Then, two call outs. Definitely, I actually would say these are probably some of my top books. This is Homer's The Odyssey, and it is translated by Emily Wilson. This took me, I started reading this in December of 2023, and then I stopped and I could not get back into it until the start of the year. And I got back into it. But once I was into it again, I just flew through this. I actually went back a couple of chapters and I reread a couple of chapters because I wanted to get back into the swing of it. But Wilson's translation is so brilliant. I don't think it brings in the sort of droning verbosity that a lot of other translations bring with the Odyssey that make it dragging and make it really uninteresting. I think Wilson's really phenomenal in the way she's done her translation. And also, if you read it out loud, you can start to hear the rhythmic adaptation that she uses when she is pulling in her words or when she uses her choice of words. And at the end of the day, this is a poem. This is an epic poem, and so should read with a rhythmic consistency. And you can start to feel that as you're reading this, especially if you are reading it out loud, you can start to feel that rhythmic consistency. And she maintains that constantly as she is writing and translating. And I just loved it. I think it's really, really brilliant. I think it's wonderful. And if you wanted to pick up a version of the Odyssey and didn't know which translation to pick up, I would highly recommend Emily Wilson. I also just have to shout out that she is the first woman to translate and publicize her translation of the Odyssey, and she has come out with the Iliad, I think like a year and a half ago, which I haven't read, but I do have, and I'm desperate to read. And then finally, I've spoken about this book so many times. People are going to be so sick of me referring to this book, but this is such a profound book. This is A Ghost in the Throat by Doireann. This book, I can't put enacting words to the feeling that this book gives. The interplay between the author's autobiographical stance as she's going through motherhood, as she's going through life, and the connection that she feels with ancient Irish poetry, and particularly an ancient Irish poem that is well known, but is lost, and the details of the poetess is lost in history, and the impact of history on woman and woman's importance in keeping history alive. There's so much in this book that I just think is so brilliant, and everyone I think that I've recommended this book to has loved it. And I got really quite emotional in the book that I'm reading at the moment, which is Words to Shape My Name. And there was a moment in that book where one of the female characters, who's an Irish woman, refers to the poem, the 1700s poem that is reflected in this book. And the impact of that was relayed in the narrative of Words to Shape My Name. And the narrator in the book particularly felt the resonance of the poem that was read. But having read that narrative, seeing that kind of effect that something like this Irish poem has had, even in a fictional sense is, it's surreal. It's surreal is what it is. Okay, that's it. This was just so much fun. I love talking about books. I would love to know in the comments if any of these are your favorite books, if any of these would be considered some of your top books, or if you have books that you would recommend to me as your top books of all time. I would love to know. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. Thank you for coming to my corner of the internet. And please, 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 please subscribe. Please like this video. I would love to get to 5,000 subscribers. So if you did like this video, if you do like this video, please consider sharing it on your social media platforms or whatever the case may be, and definitely like and subscribe if you're new here. And thank you so much for being with me and for talking to me about these books, and I hope I will see you in the next one. Thanks everyone. Bye.